If you want to be known, you have to be remembered, okay? People have to think about your church in the first place, and you want them to think about the things that we want them to think about. We don't want them to think about the falling out church split that happened years ago. We don't want them to think about the scandal that happened decades ago. We don't want them to think about even their own church, right? Like, I went to a church I grew up with nuns that slapped my hand. So anytime I think of a church, I think of nuns that slap my hand, even though your church probably doesn't have that. We want to make sure we de-associate you or de-brand you from past experiences of church hurt, church abuse, or just flat out bad churches, or maybe even churches that weren't a good fit. Maybe they went to a good church, but they weren't properly equipped to serve, or it was a bad Sunday. All of that to say, we want people to remember you for you. And one of the ways we do that in marketing is visually anchoring. So let me go into, speaking of visually anchoring, let me go into my first point here, which is what makes a church memorable. Okay, again, we want people to remember your church, not just that a church can help them, not that there's a church around here somewhere or there's a church down the road. I want them to remember Purpose Church, Hope Church, First Baptist, whatever it is. These people do XYZ. I feel this way. We talked about that last week. I feel this way. I remember them about this. When I think about them, I think about this. I remember this about them. Your visual branding is what anchors those thoughts, feelings, and what basically your message. It anchors that to your church. And this is why we have multiple churches, okay? Multiple churches. Every church is uniquely equipped to uniquely reach a unique group of people. You might have two churches in a town, for example. One church is specifically focused on deliverance and healing ministries. And we want people in that town to think, I'm sick, I'm poor, I'm desperate, I'm about to be evicted, I need to go to this church. We have another church that's mission focused. This church stays small, which, by the way, are some of my favorite clients. I feel like I say that every week. This church wants to stay small. Once they hit 50, they either go plant another church or they're sending out, training up their Timothys to go out into the mission field, right? And so when people think, I'm not getting fed spiritually, there's a hole in my heart, I'm frustrated that these questions are not being answered, we go to this church, right? Two churches doing God's work, planted fully in faithfulness of their calling, reaching two different kinds of people in unique ways. One, the Deliverance and Healing Church, has a food pantry, has a free clinic, has obviously deliverance crusades, whatever you want to do that every month. Whereas the more academic church has courses, classes, open office hours, pastors out in the community talking to people and introducing them. And then they've got more mission trips throughout the year. That's what their funds are going towards, right? With two different churches. These churches should be remembered in very unique ways, okay? Because if someone says, man, I'm hungry, I can't afford rent, I need this, they should not go to the second church because that church does not have a food pantry. That church does not have benevolence funding, right? They need to go to the first church. So it's not about remembering that there's a church in the area. It's remembering your church in the area, okay? And memorableness, if that's a word I can use, memorability, whatever you want to call it, being memorable, okay, comes with two things: consistency and repetition. And this is where churches and pastors get in a lot of trouble by staying forgetful, is they don't do these two things. Number one is consistency, okay? When I talk about your visual branding, that's like how you present yourself visually to your community, there needs to be consistency and repetition. Let me go back to consistency, right? You appear the same way, in the same manner, using the same visual elements every time. All right, when we do visual branding for a church, some people call it logo work, some people call it identity work. Logo work, again, is not all we do here, right? That's a very small part of our Be Memorable process. But what we do is we make sure that we strive to utilize consistency across all of our elements: your website, your logo, your interior decorations, your exterior decorations, any kind of promotions you do should all follow the same consistent visual guidelines with the same consistent visual assets. And not only that, it needs to be repeated over and over and over again. Once you get bored of something, pastor, your church is just now catching on and your community hasn't even been made aware of it, okay? We are going to get so bored by using the same logo, the same color, the same words, okay? You often hear me say the purpose of Nava Church marketing is to make your church better known so more people can come to your church to hear the gospel and grow the kingdom. I say that multiple times every time I talk to someone, to bring in people to church to hear the gospel and grow the kingdom. You may not have realized that yet, even though I've said it a million times in the last 2 weeks if you've been paying attention. Okay, repetition. I'm so bored of saying that. I wish I could say something else. But repetition is what makes something memorable. Okay, same thing. A great example, look at professional sports teams. You want to look at a great example of visual branding, look at a professional sports team. You're going to see the same colors, the same designs, the same elements. Some of that may change. You know, on Fox, they have their branding elements for the NFL versus ESPN, which has their branding elements for the NFL. Okay, like, but look at the consistency across those avenues. So when we talk about visual branding, we want to be consistent, use the same colors, use the same design. Make sure we stay away from the same designs, right? There's a lot of mistakes that volunteers and even church staff want to make with designing, and it causes inconsistency, and it breaks down trust. It's a very subtle thing. It's a very subtle thing, but it can break that down. And then repetition, right? You've got to get that branding, those colors, that logo, you've got to get it consistent on every mark, okay? Only then can they recognize, right? You can see the Atlanta Falcon, you can just see that Falcon and know you're looking at the Atlanta Falcons logo. It's not just a random Falcon, it's not a random football team, it is the or the Green Bay Packers G, right? I know I'm staying on sports here, but you see that G, you're thinking Green Bay, okay? So you want consistent and you want repetition. Not only that, let me touch a little bit about what we talked about last week, the messaging, okay? Your messaging has to be consistent. If you say we want to be disciples who make disciples, everything has to come down to so we can make disciples who make disciples. We have a food pantry so we can feed people, show them love of Christ, so we can disciple them to make disciples, right? Your consistency and your messaging has to be consistent, right? In the same way we just keep repeating love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control, right? We have that memorized and built in for consistency. So we remember the fruits of the Spirit. In the same way, we have to keep using the consistent language. I have one client, right? The Healing Ministry Church, boot on your neck. We keep saying that. It feels like the world's got its boot on your neck. You can't breathe. You're trapped. Okay? Pastor says that almost every week, okay? I'm the only one that notices when I watch his sermons. The consistency in messaging and the consistency in your visual representation. You should have one logo, okay? And you keep using that same logo in the same way. You don't change it. You don't write your name differently every time. It's consistent, okay? And this is what we call branding, okay? It's influencing how people think of you. Now, branding is a lot like describing what a church is. You ask 100 designers what branding is, you're going to get 117 different answers. In the same way that you ask 100 people what a church is supposed to do, you're going to get 117 different answers, okay? Basically, what branding is how you want to be memorable in your community. It's both visual and written and in the way we talk and the way we present ourselves. That's why we're specifically today talking about visual branding. So, visual branding needs to stay consistent, using the same logo in the same way, using the same colors in the same way, using the same messaging, the words, the elements, even the vibe of the imagery you use. Okay, the vibe needs to stay consistent. So that way I can see a picture and I know that's Stephen Furtick's church, or I can see a picture and I know that is Saddleback Church, right? They have completely unique visual brandings. And I'm not saying you have to go this deep, but you have to be this consistent. So if you use the same, for example, filter on Instagram, you got to use that filter for every picture you post on Instagram, okay? Very, very limited exceptions for this, all right? That's a great way to maintain visual consistency, is to keep using that filter. That's what I'm talking about. That's what we call visual branding. It's making your church memorable by making it consistent and making it repetitive in the way that we present our church to the community. If you're at a mission project locally, right? Your logo on your tent, on your shirts, all needs to be consistent. The colors need to be the same. If you're in your church, the design of your church should be heavily matching your branding, again, for consistency. Because if I hear hope, love, and peace in your church in the external, and then I walk into your church and I just see grim, bare, different colors, like there's a disconnect there. Automatically, I'm building up subtle mistrust in my mind. So consistency and repetition is a part of it. Are you tired of me hearing me say consistency and repetition? Because I am, which means you're just probably now getting it. Let me share with you some of the mistakes that growing churches don't make with branding. So if you look at a church plant, and even an established church that's going under revitalization, there are certain things that they are not doing that many churches are doing, which is causing you to spin your wheels, to constantly try something new, chase a logo revision every 3 years. Your logo should not be revised every 3 years, by the way. So if you feel like you're just not being remembered and you feel like your logo, for lack of a better word, sucks, it may be because you just got a logo, you didn't get a brand.